38 days in a row, which is getting pretty scary as a number. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm joined today by Mike. Me and Mike are going to be talking about Blood Bowl. But before we do that, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone on the Wargaming Patreon who supports us. Couldn't do it without you. And I want to say to everyone who listens to the podcast that you should stay hydrated, especially during this difficult time. And I want to say thank you to anyone who's joining us live. Like Virulent is in the chat. So thanks, Mike. Hi. It's lovely to have you on the show. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. Really good. Enjoying the sunshine.
Yeah, it's a lovely day here in England, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So hoping to get out in the garden later, but I have to get rid of work first. But
yeah. Are you coping well? I know we
really
talked about
good.
this off air, but generally, how are you coping?
I think gamers in general are well suited for isolation. So doing all right. Yeah, we're still doing a bit of online gaming, still doing a bit of painting, and just not many of my activities have taken that much of a knock, which is quite good. So yeah, doing all right, and keeping healthy. So you know.
Good. Well, that's a huge positive, and please do so. And if you are out, one of the people listening live or listening to the podcast, also stay healthy, whoever you are. So Mike's going to talk to me today about Blood Bowl, which is exciting. He's got some credentials in the field, so I'm very much looking forward to this. I know everyone in the chat has been looking forward to this as well, Mike. So
Cool.
you got Bud over in Canada. He's excited. Winner Dave, Warmaster. Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. So before we get into maybe like everything that you've been involved with in Blood Bowls in general, can we just find out some about you? How long have you been in wargaming, sport wargaming?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started in about 1990 odd. Probably along with quite a lot of people, I started with things like Hero Quest, and that was like a gateway for lots of people, I think. So I started with Hero Quest and played a bit of Warhammer, and I started with Blood Bowl Second Edition as well, which was the polystyrene board, and it was an interesting game where you played basically up to 3 touchdowns. So a game could last sort of 4 or 5 hours or 4 or 5 days until someone actually managed to win. It was a bit Talisman-esque in its length of games, but then there was a massive relaunch in sort of 1990 odd with the block dice and the 8 turns each, which made the game a bit more manageable, and you had a sort of basically a fixed time frame, a couple of hours for a game, and it's pretty much the same game as it was then. So it stayed reasonably static for the last sort of 30 odd years. If you saw someone playing in 1990 and then saw someone playing now, you'd pretty much be seeing the same game being played.
So what was it? What was it initially that attracted you? Like,
yeah, so I played it at school basically. I enjoyed the fact that you just had a few miniatures. So I'm not I'm not the best painter. I paint to a tabletop standard, depending, which can mean quite a few different things to different people, I think. But yeah, I paint in order to play. And with Blood Bowl, you only need sort of 15, 16 miniatures, and then you're ready to go. And you can also try out lots of different things. Like I had in my Warhammer days, I had sort of maybe 3 armies. I think I had Orcs and I had Chaos and possibly something else. But that was, each of those was like a significant investment. Whereas with Blood Bowl, you pay 40, 50 quid and you've got yourself a team and a few evenings of painting.
Yeah, you can definitely see why like that squad mentality has has been a big deal then, and even now. There's a lot of games that have come out which are like 4 or 5 miniatures, get started. And I definitely feel you on the painting front. As people in the chat will be well aware at this stage.
And for me as well, it's a game that you can get good at with practice. If so, I mean, I never felt I got much better at Warhammer, and lots of people do, and you know, there are obviously world-class players, but it seemed to be more achievable to get really good at Blood Bowl with basically the teams the teams start on an even keel. Like if you're using if you're using one of the best teams, then you can beat one of the other people using the best teams. And it's um, reasonably level playing field, I think, depending on which team you take. But you certainly can't sort of buy your way to a better team. You see what I mean? You can play with 16 Lego pieces or whatever, and then you can play against another 16, and because the rules are what they are, you have an even chance. You don't need to invest in great big figures.
Yeah, that makes loads of sense, and I can definitely see why it's an attractive prospect, especially in the early days. Although
Yeah.
I don't know if it was super expensive back then, but obviously also like over the past few years, I think people, especially new to the hobby, we had JP on yesterday, who like me only really entered the hobby 5 or 6 years ago. Back in the day, there wasn't the paint quality available to paint miniatures super well. There weren't the tutorials online. We're spoilt for choice nowadays in being able to be better hobbyists. So I can definitely see why that was attractive. Did the sport element add much to your initial uptake on it, or not really? Just your mates played it at school.
So I was sort of I was a chess player when I was younger as well. So the sport, I suppose, side of things was fun, but it was more the competition, I guess. It was more board gamey, I suppose, in that you had two people and you could find a winner fairly quickly. So I like the competitive edge. I know some people play games for sort of scenarios and things like that, but I was always very much a play the game to be competitive. Yeah, well, not necessarily play to have fun, but winning is fun.
It's okay. It's okay. I don't think. Well, it's not that we don't live in the world that was where apparently playing a tabletop game to win is a negative. I don't think any of us see it that way. I think you could play it in a crappy way to win, but you can play it in a very positive way to win, and I'm sure your experiences are exactly that.
Absolutely.
And I think everyone in the chat will agree with that. And if you don't, well, fight me. When I came back in, I was amazed how many paints, etc. there were. Says Scott B. So this is in the chat. My childhood memory was that of the 10 that came in a box and no more. That was all. Yeah. I think that's absolutely fair, and I think that's really interesting because you're talking about. Did you say 1990?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're talking about.
I sort of took a break between about 96 and 2008. So university and having children and that sort of thing, growing up. So did a bit of growing up and then regressed again by coming back in and getting back involved in sort of 2008-ish time. And that's why I discovered the NAF and discovered that there was a tournament scene around.
Yeah,
which is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, it's really good. I want to talk about that. I'd just like to talk about. I'd like to just put a flag in the point that 30-ish years ago, the idea of competitive tabletop sports, which is like as you said, there could be a competitive nature to it. Warhammer, whether it be 40k or AOS or any of the other games, has been through that like really tough period where it was seen as demonstrative if you wanted to actually play in a sort of competitive sense, and then you had things like the ETC and the ITC created by independent bodies, and the NAF is another great example, but I think the eldest of the examples that I know of that set a precedent for creating an environment where people could go to play to win. And it was encouraged, and I think that's actually really exciting that idea has been around way longer than people maybe realise. Because obviously it's existed in computer games since who even knows? Maybe like Smash Bros. I don't even know like how long ago it set up, but it's really exciting. So please tell us about the NAF and what that is.
Okay, yeah. So the NAF was set up in 2003, basically as a way of recording Blood Bowl games that had been played. Mm-hmm. And it was set up by sort of 10 or so people working together. It's got just a database of games with a fairly initially just a fairly straightforward overlay on them, whereby you can access your sort of player record, and there was a forum and things like that. And basically, it was a way of organising tournaments for Blood Bowl in a reasonably organised way, so that you knew when you were going to them You knew that you were going to get a reasonably standard rule set. People were going to be using the latest set of rules. There was a certain amount of, had to be advertised in advance and that sort of thing. But it was just a fairly simple way of getting Blood Bowl organized. And then it's evolved since then. So we got a sort of reasonably large database of games with sort of 250,000 Blood Bowl results in there. And there's tournaments around the world. There's probably about 10 tournaments per weekend around the world.
10 tournaments around the world a weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the UK, there's at least one a fortnight, and quite often one a week as well.
Do you know what sort of numbers they do? What sort of numbers they do?
So in terms of the tournaments that are in the database, you can have a tournament in the database with only about 8 people, but the biggest tournament we've had was the World Cup last year, which was 1,400 people.
Wow, that is incredible.
Yeah, and that was obviously huge. But then the tournaments that happen on a sort of weekly or so basis, I guess, would be between about 20 and 60.
Why don't we hear more about that? Like maybe I don't, and I'm a pretty prodigious hobbyist. I'm online all day, every day. It's super weird it's super weird that we don't hear the number 1,400 at a World Cup for a tabletop sport, which I've generally been interested in or flirted around for a while. It's odd. Like where does that information come out of?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's it goes mostly through the Blood Bowl. So there's a big Facebook group, Blood Bowl Community one, which has got 20,000 people in. You've got the NAF various websites and emails and things like that. So the NAF do sort of talk about what they're doing, but I guess unless you were trying to find out about Blood Bowl, you wouldn't necessarily find out about the tournaments.
Does it not come out through Games Workshop? Do they not talk about it?
Games Workshop. Games Workshop work a little bit behind the scenes with the NAF, but there's no public relationship really between Games Workshop and the NAF. Sadly,
I wish you could see me shaking my head. Where did the World Cup take place?
So there's been 4 World Cups. The last one was in Austria, in Dornbirn, which is just on the border with Switzerland. Basically in a massive conference centre. And we had people from America, we had people from Australia, New Zealand. One guy came over from Hong Kong as well, I think. And then obviously huge numbers of Europeans, some from South Africa as well.
That's cool. That's cool.
So, yeah, absolutely. People putting real big commitment in. And there are some people who've been to all of the World Cups from Australia, I think, which is pretty amazing. And there's been 4, and they've all been in Europe because that's where the sort of core of the players are. So we started actually in Warhammer World in 2000, so 12 years before last year, whatever that was. Yeah, 2007 was the first one, and then they've been every 4 years since then. So Amsterdam and then Italy.
Amazing.
And they've basically grown. So it went from 200 to 450 to 900 and then to 1,400. And they've all been organised by volunteers with the help of the NAF, basically. Games Workshop were only involved in the first one in terms of organising, in terms of allowing Warhammer World to be used. But basically since 2009, I think it was, we moved out of Warhammer World. That's pretty much when any sort of official interaction with Games Workshop stopped, and obviously Games Workshop stopped supplying the game for quite a long time. There was sort of 5-6 years where it wasn't being sold pretty much, and so NAF tournaments just sort of carried on because people had the stuff. So, and there were loads of independent producers of miniatures and boards. And all sorts. So we kept it going for a good amount of time, and then in 2016, the relaunch happened from Games Workshop, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk about that, but can I first ask about the build-up? So obviously the game isn't supported anymore. and I knew that there was a really big independent scene that organised itself. Do you know how that was organised? How that was like how the rules were? Because community comp or community like rules put in place is always really difficult if other people want to push back on it. How did you deal with that as a community, and how was it organised?
Well, so there was the process called the Living Rule Book.
Hmm.
Between sort of 2004 and 2008, I guess it was, and there were various iterations of the Living Rule Book, and all of those were actually supported by Games Workshop. The development of the rules happened through through NAF members. There was something called the Bloodbowl Rules Committee,
Yeah.
Which Jervis Johnson was on, and then there were various. So Jervis will admit freely himself. This is the obviously the originator of Blood Bowl, the guy that wrote it. He'll himself, he's not very good at the game. And although he came up with an amazing set of rules, the way it quite often works is you come up with a set of rules and then people go away and they try and abuse those rules as much as possible and they play them a lot. And so it was Jervis and then a load of people who were sort of really good at the game. And they tweaked it through about 5 or 6 iterations of the rules, and each of those were supported by Games Workshop, and so there was always an official set of the latest rules that NAF tournaments used. So it was one of the things about the NAF was that you said, like a NAF tournament would say, these are the rules that are being used in NAF tournaments, and that's still the case today, even with because obviously Games Workshop are now releasing fairly regular rules updates, and the NAF sort of looks after which of those rules are incorporated in which tournaments and when.
Oh, okay. So not all of the rules that come out are incorporated into the NAF rule set.
So they pretty much they have been in one form or another, but basically what the NAF are saying at the moment is if rules are released, say now, then a tournament that happened next weekend wouldn't have to use those rules. So what the NAF are doing is a yearly rules review where they look at what rules Games Workshop have released over the last year and say right now these are the rules that we will be using for the next year. So there is a NAF rule set for 2020, which, for example, I think doesn't include the ogres yet because they were released in February or so, and so it's up to tournaments if they want to use those, but there will be a standard set of rules. And if a tournament wants to deviate from those rules, then they have to make it really sort of clear in their rule set.
Yeah, I think one of the super interesting. So there is, like, to clarify, because I think it's quite interesting for some of the people listening at home. Oh, it's interesting. I'm fascinated actually. There is the NAF way of playing Blood Bowl. There is you're playing with your mates, so it doesn't really matter what the rules are. And then there are some additional rules, which I assume, like in competitive senses, no one really plays. So it's either NAF or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's the official set of rules, and the classic example is illegal procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a rule whereby there's a turn marker in Blood Bowl, for those who don't know about it, which just shows which turn you're on, and it's fairly important to keep a track of it. There's 16 turns in a game, and there is a rule in the official printed rules that says if you fail to move your turn marker along and you start doing something else, then your opponent could pick you up on it, and they get an extra reroll. And this is basically not a rule that's used in any NAF tournament settings, and lots of people use it at home and in their sort of private leagues. But basically, at tournaments you would hardly ever see it used, and that's a good example of sort of a printed rule that generally gets adjusted in tournament play.
That's honestly fascinating.
And the other big one really is about how skills are given. So in Blood Bowl, so basically the way Games Workshop market the game and publish the game is for league play, and I absolutely love league play. I have an ongoing league in Swindon with like 16 people.
Oh, amazing.
And you start with a basic team with no skills at all. And over time, if you score touchdowns with players or if you kill people with players, then they get star player points and then they get extra skills. And you build your team up and you develop it. And some people absolutely love that part of the game. But obviously that wouldn't work for tournaments. And so most tournaments say, all right, for the entire tournament, you allocate your players. You have sort of 5 or 6 skills. You allocate them to players, and then you use the same team for the entire sort of tournament. And so that's a big difference between tournament and league play.
Yeah, so it's basically like an army list would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and then you would. Yeah. So what is the? That's amazing. What's the structure of a tournament? Not the World Cup, but just a tournament generally.
Well, generally, traditionally tournaments have been weekend tournaments. There's been more of a proliferation of one-day tournaments recently. But basically, so if you take a weekend one, you'll have 6 games, 3 on the Saturday, 3 on the Sunday, of 2 hours, 2.5 hours each. And you'll go along with your army list, and you'll usually use the same team for every game. So it's almost every tournament is Swiss. So you play against a random person in the first round, and then if you won your first game, you play against someone who also won their first game, and so on and so on. So by the time you get to game 6, there's usually only one person who is on sort of 5 wins and a draw or something like that, and they're the winner. And then there's usually like half a dozen prizes given out. So you might get one for most touchdowns, most casualties, second, third, things like that.
That's really cool. I like, especially because of the format of the game. You know, it's like a sporting match at the end of the day. And then definitely. does the format change when obviously it's over 1,400 people? Like what?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the 1,400 people, it was a team event, and team events are absolutely brilliant. As you were saying, there's sort of a narrative to linking games together. So there's actually there's a tournament every year called the Bloodbowl, where you get 8 players representing a country. I guess it'd be like the European Team Championships, I guess.
Amazing.
And you get 8 players representing the country, and they come together, and one country will play against another country, and so you'll add all their scores up, and so a team, you might win 5-3 or something like that between the 8 players against the other 8 players. And that's really cool. That happens every year where there's not a World Cup. So there's been like about 13 or 14 Eurobowls. And then the World Cup is a similar version of that, but you have teams of 6. And they don't represent a country. They can represent a league or an area of a country or something like that, or just a group of mates, basically. And so the 1,400 was made up of 250 odd teams of 6. And so one team of 6 would play against another team of 6. And so at the end, you had a team of 6 that was the winner of the tournament.
That's it.
And that was over 3 days. So that was 9 games, which was a bit intense.
Yeah. Did you compete in any of those?
Yeah. So in the last one I competed, I was actually part of Team Wales.
Oh wow. Okay.
So my dad's Welsh, so I qualified for Team Wales that way. But there wasn't like an official. It only happened to be Team Wales because there was only one Welsh team going. So we did all right. We came 15th out of 250 odd. So we're reasonably pleased with that.
Congratulations, Team Wales. I don't know if you know much about the Age of Sigmar 40k community when you could talk about international events, but Team Wales are kind of the jokey team for both systems.
No, Team Wales do all right actually. The Eurobowl was held in Wales a couple of years ago. And that was because the way the Eurobowl works is it's the highest ranking team who haven't hosted it before get to host it next time.
That's cool.
So in Sweden, Wales came 4th or something like that, and so they were able to host a couple of years ago, which was really cool. It was in the Sophia Gardens, the cricket.
Oh, really? That's nice.
The cricket ground. So they have a sort of a big conference centre connected to them. So that was pretty amazing.
How long is each round? Like at a tournament specifically, how long is each round?
So you get 2.5 hours usually to play a game, which is usually plenty, and then maybe 15-minute break, and then the next game goes. Obviously lunch breaks and things like that, and the Saturday evening social is usually pretty good fun as well. So you play 3 games. You're normally done by about 6 or 6:30, and then traditionally there'd be like a Saturday evening social, and then everyone would meet up again on the Sunday, nursing sore heads, and yeah, so that's
I think
really good.
Is it? I assume it's like every wargaming event ever. People just like to go see their mates as per.
Yeah, and it's definitely evolved over time. Like I've played about 94, 95 tournaments now,
Wow.
and so you get to know people. You get to know people really well, and certainly for some people, the Blood Bowl is very much secondary. To just going along and seeing your friends, having it. There's quite often a Friday night social as well, because obviously if you, depending on how far you're traveling, then you might go down on the Friday and then have a Friday night social and then play a few games of Blood Bowl, and a Saturday social, and then a few more on the Sunday. So it is definitely a social activity as much as a competitive one. And it's really as well, because the nature of Blood Bowl means that you can go along and you can just, not everyone is gonna win. So I don't know if you want to talk about the sort of different teams that are available.
I do, absolutely. I'd like to just ask a quick question before that. I definitely want to hear about the teams. Number one, selection process for the international teams. Is it different for every team, or is there a standard kind of like process?
It's different depending on the nation. It's entirely up to the nation how they do it. The only thing that there is a committee that organises Eurobowl, and they've said that obviously you have to. It's the UEFA ways of qualifying to be on a country. So you can't just have any old random person turning up and saying, right, I'm going to play for Malta or whatever. But apart from that, so if we take England as an example. A reasonable example, because they've won, I think it's the last 6 Eurobowls, which is quite impressive. Yeah, absolutely. They've got a sort of super dominant team, and there is and the good thing about having the NAF database is that you can look at people's performance over time. So you can see who's got the best win percentages and who's good with which race and so on. And so they sort of vary. For some of the smaller nations, it's so Team Ireland are a good example. It's like, are you prepared to travel, and do you have a connection to Ireland? And if those 2 things are ticked, then you're on Team Ireland, because they're one of the newer teams. But then if you look at France have probably the biggest depth of talent of any of the nations, and they have quite a sort of super involved way of picking, involving results, wild cards, and a captain and things like that. So you might get sort of 4 out of the 8. You might get 4 that are there by performance. You might get a captain who is elected by the community, and then that captain might get some wild card picks, something like that.
Wow. Okay, that's an incredibly good explanation. Honestly, this is one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had, Mike. It's really great, and everyone in the chat's agreed. So thank you for doing this.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
So that's it. My second question before we get into the teams is, like you just said about Team England. Are there any legends, like these kind of like figures who are so good at the game, or they're just? I'm sure there are lots of characters, but are there any that really stand out, or is there anyone with like some sort of history of like legendary moments?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So the sort of the most famous person in Blood Bowl is a guy called Dave, who's everyone's got a NAF name. So he's Lycos.
Okay.
So the way the NAF database works is everyone has a NAF name as well as their real name, and these NAF names can be anything you want. Basically, it's just a username, and that's basically how people are referred to among the community, because you don't always know what everyone's real name is, and so people get referred to by their NAF name. And yeah, Lycos is probably the most famous. He's played. There's a handful of people who've played over 10,000 Do I mean 10,000? Over 1,000, sorry. Over 1,000 NAF games just himself. So he's on about 1,500 now.
Is he the only person to have breached 1,000?
So no, I think there's like about another 4 now. But yeah, he was NAF president for I think 3 or 4 terms as well. So basically, there is a NAF committee, and the NAF president is obviously the person who sort of oversees the whole NAF and is the sort of figurehead for it. And yeah, so he was there in the beginning of the NAF, and then he was NAF president for I think 8 years. And he's also been captain of Team England for a few of the times that they've won it, and he's been the best performer as well at various European championships. So he's definitely the most sort of famous Blood Bowler around in terms of tabletop. Anyway, there's a whole another sort of online community which will have different famous people within it.
I understand. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah.
That's fascinating. The man called Dave. He sounds. It's
well, there's lots of people called Dave, but yeah, but
yeah, I know, that's the point.
Lycos is that, that's absolutely why. That's absolutely why we have the NAF names, because they're all unique. So
I think I'd like to adopt that for all the other game systems as well. That'd be really fun. Some of my friends who do the 40k Stat Center, neither of them use their real name when they present it. One of them's the Falcon and one of them's Val Heffelfinger. Unsurprisingly, not his real name. So. Right, so I'm not going to ask about any scandals because currently it's a really fun, upbeat conversation. I want to stick on that. So the teams. Tell me about the teams. How do I get involved? Who do I pick? If I'm new? Yeah. Where do I start?
Well, if you're new, you can't go far wrong with getting the game from Games Workshop. Actually, it's not always the case, but at the moment, yeah, you get a pitch, you get most things you need to play with. You get an orc team and a human team. And so, basically, there's sort of 20, depending on exactly which rule set you're using. There's about 27 different teams available to play with, and some of them are really good, and some of them are not good. There's broadly 3 or 4 what are called tiers of goodness. So there's probably about 8 or so races that are the best, and you can compete against other races if you're going to use one of those. Absolutely. So Wood Elves are pretty much the best. They've got War Dancers, who are the best single sort of positional in the game, and they come with a lot of useful skills, and they're very fast and they're agile. They are quite fragile, so as soon as one hits the floor, then you'll see a load of people gathering around to foul them. But basically Wood Elves are the best. Then you've got things like Lizard Men, Dark Elves, Undead. Those are the 4 core sort of best teams. So you'll see. So when you're looking at like a European Championship team, they will all have those 4 in.
Is there a defining mechanic about all those 4, or is it that they just have more rules for how many points they cost, or or are they all individually good in their own way?
Yeah, well, they are very different actually. So Undead will smash you up. They've got mummies who are strength 5, which is stronger, and then they've got reasonably fast players as well. So it's about so it is bangs for the buck basically. So you tend to have 1 million gold pieces to build your team, and each different player has a cost. So a War Dancer will be 120,000. And so basically the better players you can get for that cost, the better your team will be. So your Wood Elves and your Dark Elves, they are better at ball handling, and good at sort of dodging through gaps and things like that, and very fast teams. And then Lizard Men are basically really solid. They've got strong play. They've got lots of strong players, and then some fast players as well. And then Undead are have a few really good players, and then just a good depth of ability.
Okay.
Yeah. And then at the other end you've got the stunty teams.
Oh my god,
which
I'm
is
excited
like
about this.
like
This is where I'm flying around.
Traditionally the ogres and the goblins and the halflings, and so an ogre team would have 6 ogres, and then a load of snotlings, which have gone through various names, runts, noblars, and so on. But basically, snotlings are the only player in the game with strength 1, and they've got armor 5, which means that to hurt them you need to roll more than 5 on 2 dice, which is obviously not very difficult. So you've got a mixture of ogres who are big and strong, and then snotlings who are not so much. And the thing with the ogres and goblins and halflings is they have what are called nega traits as well. So if you want to move an ogre, you have to roll 2 or more on 1d6, which isn't very difficult. But if you roll a 1, then they can't do anything on that turn. Which is obviously a bit of a challenge. So for an individual ogre, it's not a problem. But when you have 6 of them on your team, and you can't actually rely on them to do anything on a particular turn, then that's a problem.
Yeah, definitely. Go on after you. Is there a reason that they have such negative rules?
It's just for fun, really. So the way the teams were designed was so that there would be some stronger teams and some weaker teams. It has been deliberately tiered since the beginning, for some teams to be more challenging than others. The stunty teams are at sort of one extreme of that, because you will lose sort of 3/4 of your games when you're playing with them. So you play for them. You have to have a certain mindset to play with stunty teams. Something along the lines of masochistic, but you have to go to a tournament knowing that you're going to lose all your games. If you draw, then that's an achievement, and if you win, then you can shout it from the rooftops. And you get some people. There's one guy in the Southwest circuit who's only ever played goblins at tournaments, and he's played probably 20 odd tournaments, all with goblins, and has done reasonably well. He's one of the best goblin players around, but he's still using goblins, so will regularly lose 4 games out of the weekend, even though he's one of the best goblin players.
So he's the sharpest spoon.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you feel like, and honestly, it does sound fun, because if you say, I don't know, I don't know how I feel about that, because it's the first time I'm experiencing it as an actual intent. So I've got a question from the chat. So the idea is that some teams are meant to be good and some teams are meant to be bad, and then you know that going in, so you buy those and you go, I'm going to be rubbish, but if I get a victory, I'm smashing it. Which is, honestly, just approaching that for the first time, I'm sorry, I'm like, actually, that's quite cool. I quite like that idea. That gives me a challenge. But a question I've had in the chat is, do you feel that's also lazy game design? Like, the ability to try to counterbalance all these armies would be too hard, or all these teams, would be too hard, or like come up with some unique mechanics for them that would help compete. Like, I mean, that's also an argument. I don't know, but initially my first reaction is that's kind of cool. But what do you think?
Yeah. So there are other reasons for playing these races, in that you get to do crazy stuff. So a goblin team has a load of what are called secret weapons. So a goblin team is the only team that can roster a chainsaw on their team. They get a ball and chain fanatic who moves randomly around the pitch, sort of semi-randomly, in that you choose a direction and then roll a d3 to see if it goes left, right, or forward.
Good.
They have a doom diver where the troll can pick this goblin up and chuck him down the pitch. And they have a guy on a pogo stick who can leap around and is fast. So if you like sort of nonsense like that, then
I do.
Then absolutely. Then those are the sort of people who play goblins. I suppose that you do get, if you go to a tournament, then you'll say it's fairly likely that one of, maybe depending on the tournament, you could probably choose some favourites to win the tournament.
Races, you mean?
Yeah, well, races and people as well. So there will be occasional ones where someone turns up who's never played a NAF game of Blood Bowl in their life, but, for example, might have been playing a lot of online or has been playing in their league quite a lot, and they're actually really good, and they will sort of storm the tournament. But more often it will be the people who've played hundreds of games who are more likely to win the tournament and with their race as well. So from that point of view, if you don't want to be playing in the sort of way that means you sort of have 6 really concentrated, stressful games, whereby you have to be on it all the time. And if you make a single mistake, then it probably means you've lost the game, and then you haven't got a hope of winning the tournament once you've lost. If you don't want to play in that sort of environment, then from a certain point of view, you might as well embrace the ridiculousness and throw players around the pitch and, and do that sort of thing. So
that makes sense. I think that's fair.
So there's a sort of super competitive, and then there's the ridiculousness, and then there's a lot of middle ground as well, where you might get fairly new players who are using good races, or you get really experienced players who are using middling races to give themselves a bit of a challenge. So there's a huge spectrum of ways of approaching tournaments.
Are there any of the races that are seen as a negative play experience, or not really? That's not how it works.
The only one that regularly gets abused is dwarves, and that's not playing with them; that's playing against them. But the way a dwarf team plays, they've got move 4 as standard, which is compared to like 8 for an elf.
Yeah.
And basically, the way you play a dwarf team is you get the ball, you move up to the halfway line in your first turn. And then from then on, you move 1 square a turn until your turn 8, where you run into the end zone, having removed as much of the opposition as you can. And it's very much like moving a fortress down the pitch, basically. And this is not seen as a positive gaming experience if you're trying to play against them. By some people, I don't mind them personally, but
I am genuinely annoyed that that's the army that I bought, or the team that I bought. I got the little roller, the little truck. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, the death roller. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Heartbreak. Now I want the guy with the pogo stick. He sounds way more fun.
Yeah. So you have different approaches, and because there's like 25, 26, 27 different teams you can choose from, you like quite a lot of people will have all the teams, and then they will take a different team depending on depending on whether they have a chance of winning the tournament or not, but also what they feel like doing on a given weekend.
So one of the things that strikes me there is it feels like after a while the environment could become fairly stagnant. If it's just these 4 or 8 teams who are like in ascendancy, how does that get changed up? Or like, I'm not saying that the Grots should have their day, although obviously I am saying that. I'm more asking, because it would make sense if that would to shift around a little bit, or does it not?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And what you sort of there are occasional new releases from Games Workshop which do mix things up a bit, but not actually very much. The rules themselves have been static for quite a long time. But what happens is that you get different tournaments who choose their skill sets in order to encourage variety, for example. Mm-hmm. So I played in an online tournament last weekend. Basically, there's a thing going on at the moment where loads of tabletop tournaments are moving online because they can't be tabletop.
Yeah, using Tabletop Simulator, I assume.
Using there's actually something called Fumble, FUMBBL, which is a free way of playing Blood Bowl online.
Oh, awesome. Fumble.
Fumble, absolutely. And people play online using Cyanide's Blood Bowl 2 as well. So as a sort of one you can get through Steam, which is like between like 5 and 30 quid. So there's a huge Cyanide community of Blood Bowlers, and then there's a massive online community on Fumble as well. We could spend another sort of couple of hours talking about the online version, but
listen, we're not going to, but I'd love to have you back on sometime because I'm sure the guys have absolutely loved it.
So I was talking about
Carry on.
But the way they do it is, so the one we just played in is that what they said is. This was based on Eucalyptus Bowl in Australia, and that's a tournament that's been going for about 10 years, which is a lot of the older tournaments are sort of hitting that 10-year mark now. And basically they say they've kept a record of which teams have won that tournament before. And what they say is if a team hasn't won the tournament before, they get more gold pieces to build their team. And if a team has won it before, then they get fewer. So that was quite a fun way of tiering. But basically, each individual tournament will have its own way of tiering the teams, and so they will quite often give more skills to the stunty teams. They will say that the stunty teams can access skills that other teams can't. For example, basically there's like 5 sets of skills, and some of them you can normally choose, and some of them you can only choose if you roll a double. And tournaments will often give the weak teams access to those double skills in order to boost them up. So for example, Chaos is a great example in that they don't really start with any skills, but if you give them certain advantages, then they can become one of the best teams at removing the opposition, and then they become a tier 1 team based on the skills. And some people try with their tournaments to level the playing field as much as possible, so making as many teams viable tournament winners as they can.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. It's nice to see that it moves
where
around.
Comes from. Yeah, that's where the variety comes from, rather than the base rules changing, basically.
Okay, and then does it all go back to square for the World Cups, or they flavored differently on purpose?
So each tournament will have a fairly standard rule set. So I run a tournament in Swindon each year, Bloodbowl, and there's a load of skills, and basically that skill package, that rule set, has stayed the same for the last sort of 10 years. And then the World Cup will have actually the World Cup changes a bit, because the World Cup has different organisers each time, and so they get a certain amount of say over what the rule set's going to be. But most tournaments are just run by 1 or 2 people, and so they choose their rule set, and they normally stay the same broadly over time. So the big one in England is the NAF Championships, which takes place in Nottingham in May each year, except this year. And for that has a fairly basic rule set, which has stayed pretty much the same for a few years now.
Wow, amazing. Honestly, I don't know what question to ask at this stage. I'm just fascinated by it all. I want to know about the online stuff, or I want to know about everything. Yeah. If anyone in the chat has got any questions, please do ask. Beyond the first step of getting aboard and starting to play, have you got? Are there any resources? Good resources? I mean, this conversation has been incredible for me.
There's a rather good YouTube video that someone put together. So when Games Workshop re-released in 2016, they were good enough to send me a preview copy, and so I did a basic how to play Bloodbowl thing, and that's nearing 100,000 views on YouTube now, which is pretty good. And that's that runs you through from not knowing anything about the game at all to how all the players move and things like that, using just what's in the box. So that's a reasonable place to start. And then obviously the best thing to do is to find someone to play with, and just have a go. Really, there's a huge online community that are willing to answer questions. So there's the Facebook Bloodbowl community group that I'm an admin of, where you can go in and ask silly questions about rules. The NAF has got a decent website, thenaf.net, with loads of resources on there. There are podcasts, there are all sorts of things. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to try and find a link to that video, and when I do find it, or you can send it me, I'm going to include it in the show notes below for people to watch through. So I hope that will help if anyone does want to get that. I've had some more questions come in. Twitch Validity asks, where do you see the future of Bloodbowl heading?
Yeah, well, I can't decide whether to fan the fires at this point or not. So basically, it's looking really rosy. I do a load of statistical analysis using the NAF database, and one of those things is the number of games that gets played each year, and that's just been steadily rising for the last 8 years or so. And then it got a huge spike through the re-release, and I just think that's going to carry on going. The tournament scene is going to survive the current unpleasantness, and there are just so many people playing It's going to go from strength to strength. Games Workshop are releasing a team every quarter or so. So they've just released, quite excitingly, a Snotling team.
I saw it.
Which
Looks
which
very
didn't.
cool.
Well, it does look cool, but the interesting thing about that is it's a completely new team that basically this hasn't happened on tabletop since about 2000-ish, I don't think.
Could you walk me through what that means then?
So basically there have been there's about 20 odd standard teams. Then there are then there are Khorne and Bretonnians have only appeared in the Cyanide released online version of the game. And then there's a monkey team that is only used on Fumble pretty much.
Oh.
And then but apart from that, the teams have sort of basically stayed the same. And for the last 3 or 4 years, Games Workshop have been re-releasing. So they re-released the Lizardman team, and what they did was they put an extra positional in. So they came up with a Chameleon Skink, who isn't very good. You probably wouldn't take in a tournament setting because they lose a point of movement, and they gain some fairly useless skills as in counterbalance to it. So if you were maxing out your team, you probably wouldn't take this extra positional, and that's fine. It's all good fun. It's an extra figure that people can model with if they want to. But in releasing the Snotling team, it's a whole new race basically, and we're waiting to see what the rules for those are. There were Snotlings on the Ogre team before, but those have been renamed. So it'll be interesting to see what the rules are in terms of the Snotlings. Do they have the same stat line as the existing Snotlings that we're used to? There's a pump wagon that's going to be part of the team, which is really cool. I've still got mine from 1988 or whenever I bought it, so I'll dust that one off quite literally. So yeah, that's interesting. And there are rumours of a re-release of the box set at some point this year, but those rumours came from like a random tweet that was since deleted. So every now and again, people will talk online about a re-release of Bloodbowl, the box set, but I've no idea if those are substantiated or not. I'm not close enough to Games Workshop to know the inside track.
It's actually so because we were live during the reveal, and we were just like, well, I was just like, wow, those are super cool models, but I hadn't realised how much of a big deal they would be to the Blood Bowl community. Because obviously, I mean, that's massive. Like you said, 20 years since a whole new team has hit the scene. That's an exciting shake-up, not one that fills you with trepidation?
It doesn't fill me with trepidation. It's it's interesting because they're going to be rubbish. They're going to add. There's going to be a fourth stunty team basically, and so that'll be fun. What would cause issues is if something like Sigmarine team was released where where every player was strength 5, and then this team was going to dominate every tournament you went to. Because basically what would happen then was the NAF would have to take some sort of action and say, well, then you can't use these ones, and that's not something the NAF has done. So I was heavily involved in the NAF for a few years, and the NAF point of view is that they want to go along with Games Workshop wherever possible. They want to avoid any sort of schism and just one big happy family basically. And so it's good so the Snotling team will be embraced by the NAF, will be included in the database and so on. We'll have to do a bit of behind the scenes tinkering so that they can be included as well. And so that's really good. It's really good from our point of view that they've released a weak team, and so that can be incorporated into tournaments without any issues at all. Whereas if they released a mega powered super team, then that would cause a lot more issues for the NAF, I think.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite interesting because obviously both 40k and Age of Sigmar go through a cyclical release where sometimes you'll get a brand new army, but sometimes it's just updates. But there's normally a power spike as books go on. there's ongoing conversations that I don't necessarily think they necessarily intend that, because I don't think they designed that well to know. But that's a whole different category of conversation. But it's interesting that as a community, you guys don't overly feel worry about a new release. It's actually quite a lot of excitement. I think the same is true also for the other game systems. But I think sometimes, like if you take, I don't know if you've been keeping track with 40k, but literally one army dominated for 6 months, which is pretty dull for a lot. Which is pretty dull for a lot of people. But I don't think Blood Bowl works that way. I don't, as an outside observer, it doesn't seem to work that way. But it seems like a positive that the organisation would attempt to do something about it if it did happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very, very much a case of hoping that it doesn't, and also. I think people from the NAF work behind the scenes with Games Workshop as well. They're involved in play testing. Lots of sort of top NAF players have written sort of playbooks and things that have gone into official Games Workshop publications. They're called Spike magazines, so each race has its own Spike magazine, and that will normally have a playbook as part of it. And the last few of those have been written by sort of very experienced Blood Bowl coaches. Gegster does quite a lot of it, and he's one of the other ones who've played over 1,000 NAF games and is part of Team England, so he knows what he's doing. So while there's no official NAF Games Workshop interaction, lots of the top NAF people are speaking to Games Workshop behind the scenes and I think part of what they're doing is avoiding the superpower creep. So the Snotling release from that point of view is brilliant.
Oh, that's exciting. Another question I've had from Tristan is can you talk about third-party teams and how they're accepted in the Blood Bowl world?
Yeah, so you can use pretty much, as long as you can identify which player is which, you can use pretty much anything you want to on a Blood Bowl pitch. Basically, because it just needs to fit within the 30mm squares or whatever it is. And it be identifiable. So as long as it's a fun experience for both players, then it's absolutely fine. The third party scene sort of absolutely boomed while Games Workshop weren't providing teams, and I think they're still going strong as well, because basically the re-release has increased the player base. And that player base can't always get the teams they want from Games Workshop, and so they go elsewhere. Games Workshop have released about 10 of the races now, I think, and so the other 15 or so, people are going either to eBay for older Games Workshop stuff or to third-party manufacturers. And the only tournaments where you can't use third-party stuff is Games Workshop tournaments, and there aren't very many of those around anyway. So the actual ones that happen in Games Workshop stores are few and far between. They won't normally be NAF tournaments either, just because they don't need to be, I suppose. And so third-party. There are, well, certainly before 2016, there were a lot more third-party teams that were used than Games Workshop teams. Since then, there's been an absolute boom in people using Games Workshop teams, and you do see. So when Games Workshop release a team, then probably about sort of 2 months later, you'll see loads of those being played, not because they've got stronger, but because people like new shiny things. So they've been released and then they've been
really
picked up.
That's really exciting. Can you tell me about some of the teams that exist outside of what like a Games Workshop person would think as the lexicon of their Scriver in the chat is saying someone's got a nuns team? They have rules. Is that true?
That's exactly what I was going to say. No, so the only pure female team is the Amazon team in Blood Bowl. So they're to some people's taste and some not to others. Basically, they've all got the same stat line pretty much, with a couple of tweaks, but they're basically a female team. So I think I've got 4 Amazon teams, and so there's and they haven't been released by Games Workshop yet. So I've got a team of I've got the team of nuns, which is really cool. And I've got a team of sort of savage women, I suppose. The theory is they come from like Lustria, and they're sort of wild women type thing in bear skins and stuff. I've got another team of Valkyries, and they all count as Amazons in that they are women, so they are obviously identifiable as a Amazon team, but they just look completely different. And then even for like an orc team, there are huge numbers of different orc teams available. Basically, whenever a third-party miniature starts manufacturing, they start with an orc team, and so you might get a third edition Games Workshop orc team, you might get a second edition Games Workshop orc team, which is very different. There's the orc team from Blood Bowl 2016, and then there will be, I could probably find a dozen different orc teams made by different third-party manufacturers, and then you've got your scratch-built ones as well, where you get a fantasy regiment, chop off their weapons, and you've pretty much got an orc team. And so that's really cool. You can do whatever you like. I've seen a team of Necrons used, and you just count them as something else. So the Necron team was counted undead, and so you had some big Necrons with the mummies and some crouching Necrons with the ghouls, and as long as I say, as long as they're identifiable as the different positions and they're not going to get confused, and it makes for a positive gaming experience for each person, then people are normally quite happy with it.
Yeah, that's actually really fascinating, and also sounds like you could have like a very creative hobby on a very small scale.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the painting side is absolutely huge.
I was going to say neither you nor me are the hobbyist extreme, but is there a big like painting / getting these awesome armies on the tabletop sort of team? Sorry, yeah. Tabletops. Like, is that big? Is that part of the community?
It's absolutely huge. There's a guy at the moment who's trying to get best painted for each of the different races, and he's sort of about 18 of the way through at the moment. So he's painted up a race and taken them to a tournament and won the best painted army at that tournament, which is pretty cool. But basically every tournament will have a best painted prize to give to it, and if you go to some of the bigger tournaments, then people will make dioramas to go with them, because you've got the 16 figures, and then you can let your mind do whatever you like apart from that. So one of my favorites that I've seen is like a Christmas goblins scene, whereby
nice.
all the goblins had Santa hats, and then they had this diorama that they sat in where you could press a button and fairy lights lit up. It was absolutely huge. I've seen pirate ships with a pirate themed team on it. So someone has built a pirate themed team which they've used in the tournament, and then they've built a pirate ship that all the figures go in, and it looks meant, because the little circles for the bases fit into the pirate ship and so on, and all that sort of stuff. And you get Blood Bowl teams where they don't look like Blood Bowl teams, and that doesn't hugely matter. What was the one? Yeah, so the Christmas goblins, and they don't necessarily need to look like Blood Bowl players, as long as they don't have weapons as such, then people can use whatever they like, I think.
Yeah, well, that's honestly, Mike, I've loved this conversation. Is there anything else you think before we head off? Is there anything else you feel like we got to know that we haven't said?
I always slightly worry because I'm quite a competitive player. I'm not necessarily one of the best, but I do like to win. But I would just encourage people to come along to tabletop tournaments and to get involved in the online scene, because certainly with tabletop tournaments, once all this nonsense is finished with and we're allowed to go to them again, you will be welcomed. You can just turn up, you can play. It doesn't really matter how good you are, as long as you have a basic working knowledge of the rules. Then you may well lose all your games, but you will be welcomed, and basically you might end up playing against goblins and halflings and so on, but you don't need to be very experienced, and the tournament organizers will almost always go out of their way to make sure that you have a good time, basically, and will introduce you to people, and it will be lots of fun.
Yeah, that's really exciting. We have had one question just before we end from Couchatron. He says, ask about Dungeon Bowl.
Yeah, Dungeon Bowl was released originally. It hasn't been re-released as part of BB16, but it's basically something where you can have up to like 4 players, and you play in a dungeon. Basically, instead of playing on a rectangular square pitch, you play in a dungeon. The first thing you have to do is to try and find the ball, which is hidden in a chest. So it might be in a explosion in a chest. And so you find the ball, and then you have to get to an end zone, which is somewhere in the dungeon as well. So yeah, there's probably about a half a dozen different standard variations of Blood Bowl. So there's normally it's 11 aside, but sevens is very common as well, which is a sort of lunch break kind of game that takes about 50 minutes. And then you've got Dungeon Bowl, and then you've got things like Street Bowl and Beach Bowl, and there's something called Death Bowl as well, which is 4 players again, but is played on a cross instead of end to end. You play on a cross, and you have to try and score in the opponent's end zone without interacting with the other 2 teams on the pitch as well. So yeah, there's huge amounts of variants available. But I tend to stick to Blood Bowl because even though I've played it a lot, that I still find the variation in each game really good.
That's super
and
exciting.
The other thing I would say is if you start to play online, so I'm a big fan of Fumble. It's free. It's got a great community. You can go on and play, and then lots of people are a big fan of Blood Bowl 2 as well because the graphics are better basically. But if you start playing Blood Bowl 2, then the sort of anonymous online playing against people can be a little bit hard to get your head around, in that people will disconnect if they're losing, and they might get a bit sweary in this sort of way that people play online when they're anonymous. But if you do find you're doing that, then just find a league, come onto the Blood Bowl community on Facebook, and there will be huge numbers of leagues available, and people again will welcome newcomers with open arms.
That sounds ace, honestly.
Yeah. It's brilliant.
Yeah, you're brilliant.
I like the game. What can I say?
Honestly, it's been amazing having you on the show. Thank you so much. It's been you're an incredible advocate for the hobby, and if anyone else, I'm sure everyone else in the Twitch chat will agree. I'm going to ask you to include some podcasting YouTube, or send me some podcasting YouTubes, and I'll include them in the show notes for people.
Definitely.
So otherwise, reading it out is going to be tough. But I'll include the website Fumble as well, and everything else. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been great, Mike. I've loved it. And I'm sure everyone else has as well. If you guys have enjoyed it, thanks very much for joining me today. Don't forget you could join us tonight. Me and the 40k team will be playing some more Kill Team, which is exciting. And then don't forget to join me tomorrow to see if our special guest is going to make it this week. He may or may not. But as always, thank you to everyone on the Honest Wargamer Patreon, and thank you to everyone who listens to the podcast. Please stay hydrated. And I just want to say a massive shout out to everyone who's joined us live, like Budtastic, Virulent, Tristan, Scrivo, Gitley, Warmaster. I think there's a lot of people going out to buy some Blood Bowl teams now, Mike. So thanks for doing that. But anyway, you guys are great, and we'll see you all soon. Goodbye.